Hello, everyone, and welcome to Research and Creative Activity at Appalachian 2021. This virtual presentation is titled Early Childhood Teachers' Sensitivity to Learning Literacy Learning in Play, and is presented by Dr. Teressa Sumrall and Rebecca Payne Jordan. With that introduction, I'll let them take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teressa Sumrall. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Child Studies, and I'm joined today by my co-presenter.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Jordan, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Reading Education and Special Education. Thank you for joining us today.
We're so excited to have you here for our talk on early childhood teacher sensitivity to literacy in play. I'll begin with a little bit of a background. So play is widely recognized as one of the most valuable vehicles for children's development and learning. Therefore, it is essential that early childhood educators be able to identify children's progress towards an achievement of important developmental milestones, including standards for language and literacy development in children's play. So developing this skill is essential for teachers to be able to plan and facilitate intentional and appropriate curriculum for young children. In order for teachers to be able to recognize these connections between children's play and standards, they have to be familiar with their state's early learning and development standards documents, or ELDS for short. Ideally, teachers would have had some sort of professional development as well as other supports to increase their knowledge as well as their ability to use these important documents. So a little bit more about early learning and development standards. Every state has an ELDS document that identifies and describes expectations about what young children should know and what they should be able to do prior to entering kindergarten. Most of these documents identify expectations for development across important developmental domains, as well as content areas, as they should. But for the purpose of our research, we focused on one specific developmental domain. That was language development and communication, and we focused on one state's standards document. And although this state looks at development all the way from birth to 60 plus months of age, we focus on the developmental expectations of older preschoolers. So we wanted to provide a brief example of what an ELDS document looks like, or how is it organized in one state. So you can see here, the example comes from the domain language development and communication. Again, this is from one state's ELDS document. A subdomain under that is foundations for reading. A broad goal for or related to that subdomain is children develop an interest in books and a motivation to read. Again, that's a very broadly stated goal, and what that might look like with a infant or a young toddler all the way to an older preschooler would be very different. And the age that we were interested in, which are older preschoolers, an example of a developmental indicator here is use and share books and print in their play. And so that's something that you can observe children do. It's a very discrete skill or something that you can observe. And so that's part of the level of interest for this study.
So all of that led us to our research questions, and the things that we were particularly interested in knowing are how sensitive teachers are to literacy developmental milestones during children's play. Since play is such an integral part of early childhood development, how sensitive are teachers to noticing their literacy development? And then within that sensitivity to noticing their literacy development, how accurate are teachers at linking that evidence of development with those early learning and development standards? Lastly, we wanted to know how well can teachers plan reasonable and effective learning extensions based on what they witnessed? To answer those research questions, we interviewed 8 preschool teachers, and we presented them with 2 scenarios depicting young children engaging with literacy at play. We'll share those scenarios with you in a moment. We also shared with those preschool teachers a list of the areas of literacy development. So, for example, interest in and motivation to read, phonological awareness, writing, alphabet knowledge, as well as sharing with them a list of related developmental indicators. For example, make some sound to letter matches, use letter name knowledge, etc. And all of these derive directly from the state's early learning and development standards. We then asked the teachers from the scenarios, where do you see any evidence of literacy development in play? Lastly, we asked them how would they extend the children's learning based on those milestones that they identified in children's play.
So our sample included 8 women with a mean age of 40.9 years. 25% identified as Black or African American, and the other 75% identified as white. All 8 worked as lead preschool teachers in a pre-K classroom. All had a bachelor's degree and a birth through kindergarten teaching license. And one additional participant also had an elementary education degree and a K-6 teaching license. And the mean years of experience was 11 years.
So the first scenario, I'll just go ahead and read that to you and you see it here. This color coding relates to the different areas of development. While a recording of the name game as sung by Shirley Ellis, e.g. Katie, Katie, Bobady, Banana, Fana, Fofady, Fee, Fi, Momady, Katie is being played, Nina, Emily, and Deshawn are in the music center. Nina beats on the drum and rhythm as Emily and Deshawn march around the center to the beat of the name game song, clapping rhythm sticks. Suddenly, Nina says, "Hey, Deshawn, Deshawn sounds like dad." Deshawn laughs and responds, "I'm not a dad. Once upon a time, I might be, though." Emily says, as she holds up the D page of an ABC book, "Yeah, Deshawn and Dad start with D." Meanwhile, Anna and Jacob are in the dramatic play center pretending to be a waiter and a customer at a restaurant. Jacob hands Anna a telephone book and asks her what she would like to eat. She flips through the phone book page by page, places her hand on a line, and asks for spaghetti and meatballs. Jacob laughs and responds that he will bring her spaghetti and meatballs as he draws a picture of spaghetti on a notepad. Anna laughs and says, "Thanks." So you'll notice there that each of those color-coded, as I commented, relate to a particular, those were the evidences of development. So for example, Deshawn sounds like dad. Is there noticing that phonological awareness, that alliteration at the beginning? Yeah, Deshawn and Dad start with D is the connection to the letter knowledge, the alphabet knowledge. When Anna flips through the phone book page by page and places her hand on a line, she's developing concepts of print and indicating a use of books, understanding how books work. As she draws a picture of the spaghetti on the notepad, she's using her writing skills. So those are, and of course I didn't go through each of them example by example, but that's an idea of how the teachers were looking at this and thinking, what do I see? What is going on in this play that evidences literacy development? So our results from scenario 1. So those 6 domains, there are 6. I'm going to go through 3 on this slide and then 3 on the next. They were interested in motivation to read, comprehension and use of information in books, and book knowledge. And you'll notice that for the first domain, interest in motivation to read, about 3/4 of teachers were able to find an example in play, and all of these 6 were represented in this first scenario. So there was something, at least one thing, and several, usually more than one thing, related to each of these areas. 3/4 of teachers were able to identify an example in play, but only 2/3 could connect that to a developmental indicator, and only 1/3 could relate that back and say, oh, hey, that is interest in and motivation to read. And remember, they had the list of these 6 next to them. We weren't asking them to come up with independently this list of 6. They had that list of 6 there. So they identified the example in play. 3/4 were able to do that. And then said, what developmental indicator? Again, from a list showing them the state's ELDS. What developmental indicator would that show that the child has attained? And then which of these 6 does that relate to? And 1/3 were able to say, oh, that's interest in and motivation to read. There was also comprehension and use of information in books. Half of our teachers were able to identify a play example, at least one. Again, for most of these, there was more than one, but at least Anna, excuse me, I've lost the ability to speak. We're able to identify at least one play example and connect it to a subdomain and to the developmental indicator. One of those people also identified a play example and connected it to the subdomain, but not to a developmental indicator. So what's of interest here is that for interest in and motivation to read, you see this steadily decreasing, right? Most people, 3/4 were able to identify the example. A smaller subset of them were able to connect it to the developmental indicator, and then an even smaller subset was able to say, which of these 6 does this connect to accurately? Whereas comprehension and use of information in books, it was harder for teachers to find that example in the play. But if they were able to find that example, they were almost universally able to say, this is the developmental indicator, and this is comprehension and use of information in books. Book knowledge, 3/4 were able to identify the play example. And again, you see that same decreasing ability. It's not a fair way to say it, but decreasing. Fewer teachers were able to identify the development indicator, and then even fewer were able to identify the subdomain for book knowledge. The other 3 that I mentioned out of the 6 were phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge, and writing. Phonological awareness, all participants were able to identify at least one play example and connect it to a subdomain, and then 3/4 were able to also say, we're also able to connect that back to the developmental indicator as well. Alphabet knowledge, half of teachers were able to identify a play example and relate it to the developmental indicator and the subdomain. And writing, 3/4 of teachers were able to identify a play example and relate it to the developmental indicator. And almost all of teachers were able to say, hey, that's writing, out of the 6 of these that we've just shared with you.
So that was our first scenario. And then we also provided them with a second opportunity or second scenario here. So in this scenario, it says Paisley is in the art center. She creates a drawing, see image to the left. You see her sharing her work with Emily. When you ask her about her drawing, she points to the letter-like forms and tells you it says, me and my mom went to the park and played on the swings. The end. She then points to a letter-like double hunch form and says, this is an M. It says mommy. So again, similar to as Dr. Jordan described, each of these are highlighted in different color, these examples, and they relate back to the 6 different areas or subdomains in communication. So for example, whenever she points to the letter-like forms and tells you that it says, me and my mom went to the park, that relates to book knowledge. Using the language, the end relates to comprehension and use of information in the books. And whenever she's sharing her work with Emily, that corresponds to interest and motivation to read, just to provide a few examples there. Additionally, each of the teachers were given this work sample as well, or this picture. And so there are additional examples of both alphabet knowledge and writing in the picture. So for example, Paisley's name is written on the paper. She's also using some conventional letters in her writing. So this scenario was a little bit different because they were able to look at the work sample as well as the written scenario here. So our results for scenario 2, and I'll go over the first 3 in this slide and then the next 3 domains or subdomains in the next slide. So the first is interest in and motivation to read. Only about a third were able to identify an example in play and connect to a subdomain, but only one participant was able to connect to a developmental indicator. With comprehension and use of information in books, about 2/3 were able to identify a play example here. There's only one example to find, but 2/3 were able to identify it, but only a third were able to connect that to a developmental indicator, and a fourth of those were able to connect it to a subdomain. So like Dr. Jordan was saying, you can kind of see that decline there. With book knowledge, nearly all the participants were able to identify a play example. And there were 3 to choose from in this play scenario, so there was a lot of opportunity there. But only a few of the teachers were able to identify or connect those play examples to a developmental indicator, or say, hey, what I'm seeing here is an example of book knowledge. Unlike scenario 1 that had evidences of all 6 of these subdomains, this one only had evidence in 5 subdomains. So there was no examples of phonological awareness. With alphabet knowledge, all participants were able to identify at least one play example and relate both to developmental indicators and subdomains. And again, there were a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of examples of alphabet knowledge in this scenario. And then lastly, 3/4 were able to identify a play example and subdomain related to writing, but only half were able to relate it to the developmental indicator. So they were good at recognizing these are examples of writing, but not as great at relating it to a specific developmental indicator. They knew it was
So as I mentioned in the methodology, showing them the scenarios and asking them to connect it to a developmental indicator and to a subdomain, we also asked them how they would extend the children's how they would extend the children's learning through play. And largely the comments and extensions were appropriate, relevant, and represented sound evidence-based teaching and would likely be engaging for children. We also asked them, what subdomain would this extension that you've provided, would it address? Most teachers were accurate in identifying which subdomains the interaction would address, which was particularly interesting to us given that teachers largely struggled with connecting the evidence of play that they identified in the scenarios with an appropriate subdomain or with the accurate subdomain to which it would belong. A few teachers also made general comments such as I would praise them and tell them they did a good job, or I would ask them open-ended questions without being specific or identifying a particular evidence-based practice. And others made appropriate recommendations, but in ways that would likely disengage children from the play-based learning they were already at. So those recommendations would move them away from play and more into a teacher-centered interaction. But again, these were largely appropriate, they were engaging, and they were evidence-based.
Okay, so sort of our summary of results here. Related to research question 1, overall, teachers were able to identify evidence of literacy development, as well as pedagogical extensions to advance learning. So phonological awareness and alphabet knowledge had the greatest rate of success, and that was somewhat surprising to us given the widely noted lack of phonological and orthographic knowledge among teachers of early literacy. The subdomains in which participants were least able to identify evidence of development in play were interest in and motivation to read, and comprehension and use of information in books. And we believe that these findings indicate a real need, a greater emphasis in teacher education programs, as well as professional development in the ways in which young children engage with text, their literacy language, and various genres of text that children may explore. We were surprised how unfamiliar most teachers were with developmental indicators and subdomains. On average, matching developmental indicator and matching a subdomain were identified less than 3/4 of the time, although there was some variation between these different subdomains. So whenever we had interviews with teachers and we were asking them about their experience with their state's early learning and development standards, all of them said they had heard of it, they had participated in some professional development, but they weren't really adept at knowing exactly what was in it and how to use it in a more complex way. And let's see. Lastly here, teachers were able to plan literacy-rich experiences or literacy-rich extensions, just as Dr. Jordan was describing.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, we believe that it's important for teacher education and professional development to teach the state's early learning and development standards document. We believe that teachers need many opportunities to use the document as a living document for a variety of authentic purposes. So as we have mentioned, teachers, when we were interviewing them, they said, yes, we're familiar with it, or pointed over to their shelf where it was, but or indicated that they would like more experience actually using it and what it meant for their teaching with children. We also believe that the subdomains of language and literacy need to be broken down explicitly for pre-service teachers, so that way they know what the term phonological awareness means. That way they think about comprehension explicitly and specifically as a reading as a whole, and also as the separate components that comprise the overall concept of literacy. We were also surprised by teachers' occasional ability to correctly identify an appropriate developmental indicator, but then incorrectly identify the subdomain, because the developmental indicator list was significantly longer than the list of 6 subdomains. So again, we believe that implies that we need to have more specific and explicit description of the subdomains that come together to comprise language and literacy. We also joined the echoes of many, many others calling for more play-based assessment and more play-based instruction in teacher education programs, given all of the research that we shared with you at the very beginning about the importance of play in early childhood education and all of the vast learning that can occur within it.
Right. So lastly, our future directions, we would like to expand our sample size and also maybe consider doing videos of children at play rather than just having vignettes and a work sample. We would also like to explore teacher understanding of and confusions between phonological awareness and naming letters and phonics. And lastly, we would like to explore teacher understanding of comprehension and use of information in books in emergent literacy. So this is our contact information here. And now we'll open it up to any questions.
Thank
So
you
I
both so much. I see a couple of questions already, but just a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question, just go ahead and type that into the Q&A. But yes, so one question here is there a national ELDS or is that just for states? And do you know how widely the state standards might differ?
Those are great questions. State standards documents vary widely. All states at this point have standards for preschool age children, but they do not all have standards for infants and toddlers, although they're moving in that direction. Most states have also moved towards looking at development holistically. So all the domains of development, like approaches to play and learning, cognitive development, social and emotional development, language development. They're also accounting for content areas like mathematics, the arts, social studies. But it does vary widely from state to state. As far as like a national framework, there are some frameworks for standards like the Head Start Early Learning Framework or the Head Start Outcomes Framework that provides it for just Head Start programs, but it's a good example of something that is used in multiple states. Rebecca, are you familiar with any other? I know there's some standards for early literacy that's used nationally.
Yes, but I think, the short answer to your question is, Teresa's kind of talked through the fine points of the variation, but no, it's not like there's a Common Core. For example, even though not everywhere has adopted Common Core now for K-12, and our state, North Carolina, we adopted it and now we've moved away from it again. There isn't that overarching, most states are applying and doing this one similar thing the way there once was for the more widely known K-12 Common Core standards.
Yeah, it's one of those things I think states kind of like to have the autonomy, especially in early care and education, to sort of recognize what they feel is important and also what is based on research, and they've developed their standards from that.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, what kind of consequences might arise from teachers struggling to identify the developmental indicators?
Dr. Sumrall, do you want me to take this one first since you took the last one first?
Go for it.
Okay, so it pretty serious consequences, because essentially when a teacher is not be able to identify the developmental indicators, if a teacher cannot identify the developmental indicator, they're going to struggle to know what is the next appropriate learning objective. So what can this child do now? What are they able to do? What do they enjoy doing is always the basis for where we go next. What do they need next? What is the best way to get them there, building on their strengths and interests? And if a teacher struggles with identifying what they can do right now, then the entire process is curtailed.
And I'll give the short answer to that. It really is the foundation of intentional teaching in early childhood. You have to know children's development and where they are in order to plan intentional teaching experiences that are really going to promote holistic development.
Well, if there are not any other questions right now, I'd like to thank both of you, Dr. Teressa Sumrall and Dr. Rebecca Payne Jordan for a really informative presentation. We appreciate you, and thank you all for your attendance. So don't forget to visit the event website and to view other available sessions, our research posters, and recordings if you can't attend live. Thanks so much. Everybody have a nice afternoon.